of Representative in the Continental Congress was potentially dangerous business.
It's not entirely clear that independence is the aim, but they are beginning to think we need something different.
This is a seismic shift. This was a dramatic change in who and what they were. It was like stepping into the unknown.
They know that they're putting not only their reputations, not only their wealth on the line, but their lives.
On the 10th of May, 1775, representatives from the 13 British colonies of North America took their seats in the Continental Congress at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. Among them, men from the north of Ireland. Just 3 weeks earlier, the first shots of what would become the American Revolutionary War against Britain had been fired at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts.
The delegates have come to Philadelphia in May of 1775 to talk about what to do. There is talk in some of the colonies about armed resistance, and they want to organize together. They know none of the colonies can face the power of the British government by themselves.
It's a pretty intense time as the delegates are arriving to Philadelphia. The colonies are in a bit of turmoil. There's been some fighting, and so it's a bit of a tumultuous moment as these delegates are arriving to the city.
The men in Continental Congress are having to process the fact that there have just been these huge battles in Massachusetts at Lexington and Concord. The notion that they are engaged in military conflict with the most powerful army on the planet strikes fear in people's hearts.
It's still fresh, it's still new, things are moving very quickly, and so there's a lot of very strong feelings. There's also a lot of, as you can imagine, anxiety and some nervousness about what the future might hold.
The men arriving at what is now called Independence Hall were a who's who of America's founding fathers. Benjamin Franklin was there, Thomas Jefferson, and Charles Thomson, the Secretary of the Continental Congress, born near Maharah, County Londonderry. These men would change the course of world history and create a document the words of which are known around the world and treasured by Americans today.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal,
that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights,
that among these are life,
liberty,
and the pursuit of happiness.
Of the 56 men who put their name to the Declaration of Independence, 4 were born in Ulster. 2 others were born to Ulster immigrants. Men and women from the north of Ireland were the friends and comrades of the American founding fathers. They were their teachers and their religious leaders. One of the largest and most impactful immigrant groups in 18th century America, they were to play a significant role in the movement towards independence. But on the 10th of May, 1775, the men meeting in Philadelphia did not want American independence. What they wanted was reconciliation with Britain.
They mostly want to have local self-governance. They want their colonial assemblies to be the one that levies the taxes. They want to be able to maybe have a little bit freer trade, but they don't, for the most part, want to leave the British Empire because they feel like the British Empire is what guarantees them prosperity and wealth.
The British Empire in America was made up of 13 separate colonies along the Atlantic coast, from Georgia in the south to New Hampshire in the north.
The best way of thinking about it is not as kind of one unified area. They're all independent colonies, and they almost function like different countries, and the cultures of these places are dramatically different. So if you were to travel all the way down from New England down to the Chesapeake, you're really walking through different worlds. It's like going from France to Germany.
The different colonies are very different from each other, different economic systems, from the southern colonies, which depend on slave labor to produce a commodity, rice or tobacco, to New England, where you have these, small Puritan communities which are bound together and have this long history, and then Pennsylvania is kind of this middle ground. But you also have, in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s, a tremendous influx of people from Northern Ireland.
We're in Coleraine, and when Coleraine was first settled, the church, the tavern, the cemetery, the schoolhouse, all within a few hundred yards of where we're standing.
Ken Shearer is descended from McClellan, Thompson, and Shearer families from Antrim, who settled in Coleraine in the 1740s.
Just imagine, they're getting off a ship. Hopefully they had some place to stay before they got to Coleraine. But they get here, it's just raw land and mostly trees. And they were obligated to establish a church, till 5 acres of land, possibly even a school of some sort, but schools came later. And then, of course, establish a minister in that church within 5 years. Supposedly, the first houses were just crude log cabins to have some kind of coverage, and then as time went on, sawmills came to be. Up went the stick-built house. It'd be like going out into Alaska now with an axe. What do I do? Start cutting trees, I guess. A very prominent family of the day was the Wilsons. He was a captain, and hence the veterans marker. And then the Stewarts. Mr. James Stewart, he established a school just down the street a little bit. It's more Wilsons. There was a lot of Wilsons. And then the Reverend Samuel Taggart. And he was not the first minister, but the first prominent minister. I think he was minister for 40-some years.
During the Revolution, these families from Ulster would be among the first Americans to publish resolves in opposition to British rule.
When an issue came up, Coleraine would just jump into the foray, whether it was the Boston Tea Party, the Revolutionary War, and then the Shays Rebellion, to which there were more people from Coleraine than any other town in Western Mass that were involved in that rebellion, because our taxes are too high. They're taking property away from these farmers here. They're just trying to survive. So they jumped right into that one, too.
People from Ireland began arriving in the American colonies in large numbers in the early 1700s. They were predominantly Presbyterians from Ulster, often referred to in America as Scotch-Irish.
Starting in the 1720s, as the rents on farms start rising, these Presbyterians in Ulster increasingly feel that they are being pushed off the land that should be theirs. They have this sense that the land that should have been theirs and the faith, their Presbyterian faith, that should have been free, were both under the thumb of the British government and of rich elite landlords. And they are seeking a place where they can have both their faith and their farms.
There is religious pressure kind of pushing them out of the north of Ireland. But by the same token, really most of these immigrants came because they were in pursuit of economic opportunity. They come into Pennsylvania, but then many of them continue to migrate either further into the Midwest or more likely into the southern backcountry, and they do so in pursuit of economic opportunity.
This movement in the 18th century is one of the great movements in all of human history. The largest group of non-Africans that are going to be moving across to the American colonies are going to be immigrants from Ireland.
They're land-hungry people. They're on the prowl for a place they can call their own, that they can have their own farms, their own traditions, their own communities, preferably as far removed from coastal elites as possible.
Women's stories have been mostly absent from the stories of the Scots-Irish. When you look at individual families, you start to see how important women were. They're in the shadows, but they're there. You know, it's not just men building the frontier, it's also women. One of the things that a lot of the Scots-Irish farm families do is that they follow a lot of patterns that had prevailed in the north of Ireland. Growing flax, spinning flax into thread, hiring weavers to weave it into cloth. And women are absolutely instrumental in that process. And so you see a kind of replication of some of the ways that the household economy becomes very vital to allowing Scots-Irish families to get established here in the colonies.
Very often, the folks coming over from the north of Ireland were pushed to the frontier, either because of boundary disputes among provinces or to serve as a bulwark against incursions by indigenous peoples.
Skaded waje on gwat na goe, det non yo. Hadi on gwet dage, dane hodi, ani on gwat na got dio.
We have tobacco here. We're offering it back to our ancestors as our spirits within the tribe that lived here, and give them thanks for letting us walk on their land and tell their story.
Susquehanna people lived in large villages of, I would say, an average of 40 to 50 longhouses. Longhouses house multifamily units, all related to the same clan. Here we have record of them being about 20 foot wide, 60 foot long, 20 feet high. They're made from saplings bent and covered with bark. And they are sort of the more permanent dwellings. In the 1720s, we start to see people come scouting what natural resources are over on this side of the river, what can they get? And then they begin to push for settlement here. So in the 1730s, we start to see the Scots-Irish come across and settle in the southeastern part of this county. One of the things that the Pennsylvania colony does with the new people that are coming, the Scots-Irish people, is to position them between
them, the colony, and their enemies. So they sort of have them settling on the frontier.
Early leaders of Pennsylvania said, well, you know, we need some people as, quote unquote, a hedge against Native Americans. And as one person famously put it, those brave defenders of Derry and Enniskillen, let's bring them over now to kind of the wilds of North America, where they could serve as a European hedge against any Native American hostility.
Contact between these Scots-Irish settlers and Native peoples is actually quite peaceful. There's clear evidence of a lot of trade contacts between them. Many Scots-Irish get involved in the fur and skin trade with Native peoples. They come to America seeking economic opportunities, and this is one of the avenues that they pursue for those economic opportunities.
After Lexington and Concord, one of the things that the Congress has to do immediately is figure out what to do about this sort of an army that is growing up around Boston.
Within a few weeks of convening in Philadelphia, the Congress creates the Continental Army, this formal fighting force. And they put someone at the head of the army that is very well trusted, George Washington. The Continental Congress is trusting Washington to not only lead the army, but to make it a body that could actually stand up to the British Army.
The Continental Army would have been made up from men all across the Northeast and the South, and being trained to fight professionally, one of the most powerful militaries in the world at that time.
Just over a decade earlier, Americans had proudly fought alongside the British in the 7 Years' War, a dispute between Britain and France over territory in the colonies that turned into a global conflict. Known in America as the French and Indian War, some of those who felt its impact most acutely were the Scotch-Irish living on the Pennsylvania frontier.
The 7 Years' War is experienced differently in so many different places. If you're living, for example, in New York, your memory of the war is going to be the dramatic growth of that city and the movement in of so many British troops. But if you're further removed on the frontier, it's a different war altogether. Native Americans have to decide ultimately which side they're on, and then soon enough they begin attacking isolated settlements. So many of these settlers who came in times of peace and relative prosperity now find themselves between the hammer of various imperial powers and the anvil of Native American communities.
In 1754, war starts to kick off here in the Americas between the French and the English. We see French, and particularly their native allies, they start to conduct very extensive raids on Pennsylvania's frontiers.
Because of the terrors that people on the frontier experienced during the French and Indian War, loved ones killed, scalped, tortured, babies killed, farms destroyed. Those problems were complicated by the refusal in Pennsylvania of the Quaker-dominated government to sufficiently supply defenses for the frontier, leading frontiers folk to take matters into their own hands.
There's an immense amount of anti-Indian sentiment that's being stoked. The Paxton Boys, well, they call them the Paxton Boys, but they're really a group of men who decided that they were going to take out their rage on peaceful Indians. It didn't matter who they were, what they were doing. It didn't matter that they were basket makers trading in the market. It didn't matter that they were working on the farm. It didn't matter that they were old. It didn't matter that they were children. They came, they murdered, and they just started seeing all Indians as really horrible and something that needed to be eradicated.
This perfectly peaceful community of Native Americans was set upon and massacred. Actually, the massacres took place in two stages. The raiders, who were largely Irish Presbyterian settlers in that part of Lancaster County, were the perpetrators.
The Paxton Boys kind of come out of this fragmentation of whatever consensus had existed on the frontier. They were seen as the epitome of white savages by many people in Philadelphia. What the Paxton Boys signal are underlying tensions and the internal divisions and factionalism that's going to become evident during the Revolution.
The British and their American colonies won the 7 Years' War, but victory came with a heavy price tag. To raise revenue, Parliament introduced a series of taxes on the American colonies that would provoke an immediate reaction in Massachusetts.
Boston, it's a tightly packed place, surrounded by water and surrounded by bigger agricultural towns, as Boston had become really a trading town. And it also has dozens and dozens of taverns where people gather and discuss things or debate things. It has a lot of newspapers. So there are lots of political debates in the papers, which then are carried over in the taverns, in the coffee shops, in other places where people gather.
In the wake of the 7 Years' War, what we sometimes refer to as the French and Indian War here in the United States, Britain had a massive bill, a lot of debt from that conflict, and they gained a lot of territory from the French, which they then have to maintain, which costs a lot more money as well.
Parliament sees these expenses they have, which are growing because the empire is growing. They also do have a big debt from the war. And they see all of this trade happening between other parts of the empire and say, we really should regulate this. So the first thing they do is tax sugar, the sugar imported into the colonies. Remember, the sugar is the big commodity of the 18th century. It's what's making the British Empire really prosperous. And then in the wake of this, Parliament passes a stamp tax. And this is a tax on paper, newspapers. Any kind of legal document has to have a revenue stamp. And what happens in 1765 is one of the stamp collectors is a fellow named Andrew Oliver. He has his warehouse destroyed by a mob in the summer of 1765. So you have Boston really turning from, we don't like these taxes, to, we are destroying the homes and the warehouses of the people who are trying to enforce the law.
In 1765, a secretive, loosely organized network of political activists, merchants, and working men came together under the name the Sons of Liberty. The early architects of American resistance, their numbers included men who would become the founding fathers of the new nation.
The Sons of Liberty really are formed as a start to resist British tax policies.
One of their most fervent and radical voices came from a Scotch-Irish physician named Thomas Young.
Dr. Thomas Young arrives here from Ulster County, New York, and he becomes one of the most radical of the Sons of Liberty. His His parents had immigrated from Ulster to a community, really, of Scotch-Irish people in New York. But Thomas Young and his family had been struggling against the large landholders in New York, the people who really wielded power there. And also, he's a doctor, so he sees these ills in the body politic as something that needs to be cured. And he comes here and he sees serious problems emerging because of the intrusive hand of Parliament, and sees, well, we need to take more extreme measures to deal with this.
Even the Sons of Liberty could not have foreseen that within a decade, America would be at war. In the summer of 1775, American militia had captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York, and the new Continental Army surrounded British troops in Boston. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress began to take on the functions of a provisional government, but they still had no clear plan for what to do next.
At that point, pretty much everybody is still working on reconciliation. There are definitely, in Massachusetts especially, voices that are already pushing for independence, but Massachusetts is really still an outlier at this point in time. And the predominant attitude is reconciliation.
Something that we tend to forget is that the American colonists thought of themselves as Britons, and they wanted to defend their rights as Britons. George Washington believed that he was fighting to uphold the British Constitution. And it's not until later that they start to think of themselves as a separate group of people with rights that needed to be affirmed in a different way, that maybe the king was not the protector of their rights.
American colonists considered the British constitutional order as the blueprint for good government. The Glorious Revolution in which William of Orange came to the throne had established a contract between monarch and people that they now believed was broken. In searching for a new roadmap of what to do next, the men in Philadelphia drew upon the radical ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, in particular those of one of the Enlightenment's leading thinkers, Francis Hutcheson, brought up in Saintfield, County Down.
The Scottish Enlightenment philosophers believe that we all have natural rights that come from God or nature rather than government. We form governments to secure these rights, and that when governments threaten the rights, we have the right to alter and abolish them. The Scottish Enlightenment inspired the American founders, especially Thomas Jefferson, who of course wrote the words of the Declaration. It's impossible to overstate Francis Hutcheson's influence on Jefferson, because it was Hutcheson who came up with the definition of the difference between an alienable and an unalienable right.
Francis Hutcheson had written this book on moral philosophy, and it does talk about when colonies are at the right stage of achieving independence. He wasn't thinking about the American colonies, but these folks are imbibing a lot of this. What would have been very radical ideas in England here are taken as kind of mainstream ideas because they do describe the world they live in. So they are beginning to think we need something different.
These ideas were central to the curriculum of Donegal-born teacher and Presbyterian minister Francis Allison, who had studied under Francis Hutcheson in Scotland.
Francis Allison helped train many young men who would become ministers or magistrates in the colonies. He is imbuing them with Scottish philosophy based on the thoughts of moral philosopher and Presbyterian pastor Francis Hutcheson, who believes in things like a bicameral legislature and religious toleration and other means that will help ensure a just society. He also talks about the right to resist tyranny where tyranny exists. And so these thoughts are very important in helping to shape The people who will say, hey, wait, we're not happy with what's happening, and so we are going to resist, and we now have a language with which to resist.
Most Americans were not reading Hutcheson. They didn't know about the Scottish Enlightenment. But they did read their Bible, and the first great rebellion to sweep across the colonies was a religious one.
One of the things that we underestimate about the American Revolution is kind of how important God and religion are to the American Revolution. We often forget that when it comes to making meaning, for common people anyway, it was religion mattered more than anything else. And that clearly is going to be the way for most of these immigrants from Ireland and for their sons and daughters. As they come over and they're kind of establishing communities, religion is going to be absolutely critical for them to understand and appreciate who and what they are.
The Great Awakening was part of a transatlantic revival tradition that was especially strong in places like Ireland. And it was an effort through charismatic preaching to create a crisis of the conscience.
It's to take care of someone and restore some people that you know.
So that people would have an emotional response to what they were hearing, be aware of their own sinfulness, and then lead to a conversion.
You are someone, you're a Christian, you're called to serve. Everyone say serve. Serve. You're going to put their concerns and their issues above yours, and you're going to serve them and honor them.
Two key people for the Great Awakening, without whom we probably would not have the Great Awakening, are William Tennant and his eldest son, Gilbert Tennant. William Tennant came from Ireland, where the means of training young men who could not go to Edinburgh for ministry would be little schools or academies that were run in people's houses. So he came to the United States and started one of these similar academies, which his detractors called a log college, and that name stuck. He trained 18 men who became revivalists. Among them was Gilbert Tennant, his eldest son.
The younger Tennant, Gilbert, is going to be one of those pupils at the Log College, and he's going to be one of the first disciples sent out as kind of the revivals begin to take hold of all of these communities.
The revivals were chaotic. They were full of energy, and there would be one, maybe more preacher that would preach very charismatic preaching.
The challenges can be the people who are actually coming with the power of God.
And as a result, people would be having these ecstatic experiences. Outward displays of screaming or crying or fainting were expressions of the Holy Spirit at work in you.
The Great Awakening breaks down all those denominational barriers and says, for example, I don't care what particular denomination that you are a part of, just tell me that you are saved. And so when we think of kind of evangelical religion today, the Great Awakening is a great example of that.
One thing that had happened with the Great Awakening is that so many Scots-Irish brought that awakening down to the southern colonies as well and fomented these beliefs.
Among the early voices calling for spiritual awakening was Alexander Craighead, a controversial and fiery revivalist born in Donegal. He led his congregation in a renewal of the Solemn League and Covenant signed by their Scottish predecessors to promote Presbyterianism and limit the king's power in religious affairs.
Alexander Craighead, who was an American Presbyterian minister in Pennsylvania, is kind of the archetypal radical Presbyterian in the backcountry. Craighead gathers together the Presbyterians of Octorara, Pennsylvania in 1743. That's the 100th anniversary of the Solemn League and Covenant. and in essence asks them to make a decision. Does this still apply or doesn't it? And they draw their swords and sign a new covenant, just like the old one, declaring that they too are an independent people dedicated only to their faith and their local authorities, not to the crown thousands of miles away. For the most part, this is a Scotch-Irish level of cantankerousness, kind of sowers of sedition is what they're called. People who are willing to plant the seed of rebellion well before the harvest is needed.
In the years leading up to the Continental Congress of 1775, resistance to British rule was spreading across the colonies. But in the back country of North Carolina, a group calling themselves the Regulators took up arms against their own colonial government based in New Bern.
I think the regulator movement in North Carolina is a great example of some of the tensions between settlers and between Eastern governments. A lot of people who are Irishmen and women and the descendants of Irishmen and women are living in these regions. They're going to feel in North Carolina especially that they are, if you will, suffering because of what government's not doing for them at the time. And that's going to lead a bunch of people to kind of establish themselves as regulators. These people are now going to take their own affairs into their own hands because government's not doing what government is supposed to be doing. And that's what we call regulation.
The North Carolina regulator movement in the early 1770s is what the American Revolution could have been if elites had never joined the cause. It's grassroots, it's rural, and it's about taxation and oppression and corruption. These are people who feel that their rights are being infringed upon, and they are not going to take it anymore. When they rise up and decide that the best course of action is a direct military confrontation with authorities, their minister, David Caldwell, tries to caution them that this may not be the right route. Caldwell ends up being proved right when they lose the Battle of Alamance and the elites from New Bern do indeed impose a kind of social and political order on the backcountry.
The regulation movement may have been crushed, but it struck a blow against bad government that would not be forgotten.
By the time you get to 1773, but particularly 1774 in places like Boston, that's when the Battle of Alamance means that much more, when people can look back toward it and say, oh, we see a pattern that's being established here.
In 1773, the British Parliament levied a new tax on the colonies, this time on the importation of tea. It sparked fury and outrage and would set in motion a series of events that would change American history.
What happens here in Boston is just by chance. The first of the tea ships arrives here in November of 1773. Under British law, a ship can be in port for up to 20 days without paying a tax on its cargo. December 17th is the day the clock expires, and so there's a big meeting at Old South Meeting House all day, and people have come from all around because this is exciting. Of course, there's not a whole lot else to do, and the place is packed.
The meeting had been called by the Sons of Liberty, who once again stood at the forefront of defiance against yet another crippling tax imposed by the British government.
Samuel Adams says this meeting can do nothing more to save the country. And that's apparently a signal. Somewhere up in the gallery, someone lets out a war whoop. Out in the street, someone lets out a war whoop. And from 3 different places around town, groups of about somewhere between 20 and 30 men. Many of them are dressed as Indians. They'd simply thrown a blanket over themselves, put soot on their faces, and they begin marching down to the wharf. So Some people who don't leave are Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Thomas Young, who stay there giving speeches. They want everyone to know, we're here. We're not part of what's happening down there. Thomas Young apparently gives a very witty speech about tea and the deleterious effects of drinking tea. It makes you nervous, makes you agitated. Meanwhile, down at the wharf, these guys are going aboard the ships and they're hoisting up chests of tea. They very carefully unload all of that tea onto the dock and then set about destroying the tea. This is Parliament's tea, actually. Parliament's involved in this. So Parliament responds pretty forcefully by shutting down the Port of Boston, suspending the government of Massachusetts, essentially shutting down the ability of people in Massachusetts to elect their town meetings. What people in the other colonies see is, if Parliament can take away their right to govern themselves, they can take away our right to govern ourselves. If they can shut down Boston, they can shut down New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. So 1774 is really the year this turns into a revolution, because now Parliament has taken away our power to govern ourselves.
1774 is for Americans an annus horribilis, that they're looking at one awful thing after another that is pushing people off the fence and pushing them toward independence.
Individuals like Thomas Young were leading players in the American Revolution, but Scotch-Irish communities would also influence decisions taken by the men at the Continental Congress.
One of the things that I think is important to realize is that, yes, these conversations are taking place in Philadelphia. Yes, these delegates have come from all over the colonies. But at the same time that's happening, there are people at the state level who are having those conversations. There are people at the local level. There are towns that are holding meetings where they're sending letters to Philadelphia to say, hey, we support this move for independence. We would like you to as well. There's a group in Topsfield, Massachusetts. They have this meeting and they put together a resolution. I'm gonna read a section of that. The greatest and most important question that ever came before this town. A few years ago, sir, such a question would have put us into surprise, but the scene has now changed. The unprovoked injuries these colonies have received have been cruel and unjust to the highest degree. And so, in some ways, we can think about the Declaration of Independence that's coming as kind of reflecting not everyone's sentiment, but certainly a popular sentiment that is already sweeping through many of the colonies, through different towns, through different cities, even in some rural areas, where people are coming together and having these conversations.
In 1775, the Continental Congress asks local communities to organize local committees that will manage local affairs in this crisis. The people of Mecklenburg take this a great deal farther than anyone was ready to go, or that the Continental Congress intended. When those Mecklenburg residents arrive in that room to respond to that call, everything they've heard about every Sunday of their lives, that their ancestors stood up with a covenant with God against an evil king, that their ancestors fought and even died at Derry and at Enniskillen, and now their time has come to put that same cosmic battle into place. They take things a great deal farther than anyone else in colonial America is ready to go. They declare the laws of Parliament null and void. They declare the authority of the king no longer valid in the backcountry, and that henceforth they will take their orders from the Continental Congress.
Throughout the colonies, different communities are creating their own declarations of independence. They're creating their own petitions. They're spreading this vocabulary of freedom and equality. And that makes its way back to the Continental Congress. And so there's an awareness from the representatives at the highest level of what the conversations are happening in each of the colonies.
In June 1775, the Continental Army won a major battle at Bunker Hill in Boston. Yet the consequences of cutting ties with Britain were so grave, the members of the Continental Congress appealed to the king one last time.
In July 1775, Congress drafts the Olive Branch Petition. It's basically a letter to King George III asking him to intervene in these troubles, to bring his ministers, bring Parliament back into line, to remind them of the rights and the loyalty of his colonial subjects.
The biggest problem with the Olive Branch Petition is that the King of England is not particularly interested in it. And at this point, I think that he thinks the colonists are already gone a step too far. And so he basically ignores it.
When the Olive Branch Petition reaches King George, he also has gotten news of the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill has caused 1,000 British casualties. This is no little rebellion in the streets, and he is angry. The Olive Branch Petition gets thrust aside. He declares the colonies in open rebellion, and he sends 20,000 more troops to put it down.
As tensions rose and the conflict intensified, in January 1776, political firebrand Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a pamphlet that electrified the colonies and demanded American independence.
Before Common Sense comes out, a lot of folks are really sort of seeing the problem as like, it may be the king's ministers, it may be the system, it may be the laws, but it's not the king. And one of the things that Tom Paine does brilliantly in sort of like plain English that's easy for people to understand, he kind of flips things on his head and says the king actually is the problem.
Thomas Paine says all of these things that seem radical, that seem like treason, independence, creating your own republic, it's not crazy, it's not radical, it's not treason, it's common sense. He says not the king should treat us better, but it makes no sense to have a king.
Common Sense sells like hotcakes. People are reading it. People are talking about it. It's almost inescapable. And I think it does a great deal in sort of pushing popular sentiment, at least, further along the lines towards an independence movement.
In some of the colonies, there really isn't a royal government anymore. Royal governors are fleeing to ships off the coast, and so slowly across many of the colonies, they're actually building self-government without ever having declared independence.
In Pennsylvania, Quakers and Anglicans held the majority in the local assembly. They strongly opposed any movement toward independence.
Many of the Scots-Irish are quite frustrated with a kind of lack of representation in the colonial assembly, again, which is dominated by Quakers. The Quakers withdraw from government because they are opposed, they're pacifists, and they're opposed to war. And so suddenly it provides immense opportunity for people like the Scots-Irish to come to the fore of politics in the colony. They lead this charge to a much more progressive, much more radical government that dominates for the extent of the revolution. They end up carrying out what Thomas Paine had outlined in his pamphlet, Common Sense. Common Sense is published in Philadelphia, so clearly he's part of this milieu that well-educated Scots-Irish and Scottish people are a part of here in Philadelphia as the revolution approaches. These ideas are circulating, and they essentially take up his charge.
It's the Irish Presbyterians in combination with the German Reform who take the opportunity presented by the revolution and seize power. So having a new group in charge means that there'll be political support within Pennsylvania for the independence project.
The American colonies had been at war with Britain for over a year. They had exhausted all avenues for reconciliation. On the 7th of June, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia formally proposed independence.
By June of 1776, things are starting to kind of deteriorate a little bit. In this moment, Richard Henry Lee brings a resolution forward. In it, he declares that, quote, "United colonies are, and right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved."
In early June, they decide that they want to take a vote on independence, and they're not quite ready to take the vote, but they decide to set up a committee to draft that statement of explanation.
The Committee of Five is chosen to draft a Declaration of Independence, but pretty soon it's clear that Thomas Jefferson is just gonna write it. He's the best writer. And so he sits down to draft this declaration that also will explain to the world why the colonies feel they should be independent.
These opening days of July 1776 are very stressful for the Continental Congress. They're right up to the moment of voting. Opinions are changing. News is arriving from home colonies of how the delegates should vote.
On July 2nd, when they voted on the Declaration of Independence, they weren't yet unanimous, all the delegations. They did not yet have a vote from New York. The New York delegation had to actually, ride back on their horses back to New York, consult with the people of New York, then get permission, and then come back to Philadelphia.
By July 4th, the Continental Congress is in agreement and they approve the Declaration of Independence. As soon as the Continental Congress approves the Declaration of Independence, they make a plan to publish it. And they enlist the help of a Philadelphia printer, John Dunlap, whose printing office was just a few blocks from the Pennsylvania State House. John Dunlap was born in Strabane, and he emigrated when he was very young. And by 1771, he set up his own newspaper, the Pennsylvania Packet. And he becomes part of this really rich printing community in Philadelphia.
Late afternoon, early evening, they figure out we need this printed, and let's go to Dunlap. And overnight, he and his assistants are typesetting, proofing, printing, and getting what is estimated to be a couple hundred copies together by morning to go out on horseback. When Dunlap was working on the Declaration, the typesetting with these tiny little pieces of type being pulled out of case drawers would have been very rapid. I would imagine the broadside was set in pretty short order, like 20, 30 minutes. They would have been working by candlelight. Overnight, it was printed, so it would have been pretty dark. That would have been incredibly intense, knowing the significance of the document that they were ready to produce.
There are 3 names on the Declaration of Independence when it is first printed, and 2 of them happen to be born in Ulster. You have John Hancock, he was president of the Continental Congress from Massachusetts. Just below that is Charles Thomson's name as secretary, affirming that this is an official document from the Continental Congress. And then at the bottom of the broadside is the name of John Dunlap, the printer.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights,
that among these are life, liberty,
and the pursuit of happiness.
Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends,
it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government.
The Declaration of Independence has so much in it, it's so rich. Americans tend to focus on the second sentence, and that is the sentence about human equality, the idea that human beings build governments to secure their rights, the idea that human beings have the right to change their governments when they're not working for them. That is the essence of the American philosophy of politics.
What we remember are those declared self-evident rights, the rights to life, to liberty, to the pursuit of happiness, and that at least we aim to believe that all men are created equal.
For many generations of Americans, those words have had enormous power and have become almost sacred to who we are as Americans and to what the future of the United States could be.
But in the summer of 1776, no one knew what the future would hold for this new nation.
The Declaration of Independence is not kind of a snap, easy break with the past. It's a traumatic, difficult break because they're breaking away from everything they knew themselves to be.
The Continental Congress decides to declare independence. They sign their names to a piece of paper and essentially are committing treason.
They know that they're putting not only their reputations, not only their wealth on the line, but their lives. They've declared independence, but they have not won independence.
Scotch, Irish revolutionaries, philosophers, and frontier settlers had been integral in shaping the movement toward American independence. In the years to come, they would also influence the democratic institutions of the new republic.